nervous when I'd see it, then I'd get nervous. And so I just started like just click record and don't even worry about the countdown. So cool.
Isn't it nice how, a few years into anything, the stuff that used to completely unravel you, you're like, I got it. Or
Yeah,
even if you don't got it, you're like, it'll be fine.
exactly.
And you kind of know that there will always still continue to be surprises. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
totally.
And I mean, I think that was why your book was so good, right? Because we're always dealing with constant change now, even more so than ever before. I think even in our careers, I think if you're pushing yourself, you're gonna bump up against this feeling of fear all the time, right? And
Mhm.
I noticed it happened to me today. Right before this call, someone asked me if I could help them with something, and I'm like, I can. Yes, I can do it. Am I like 100% like confident? No, but I'll figure it out. And so that kind of fear came over me for a second. So
Well, I do think, and this is broadly, far beyond our careers in this lifelong quest that I've had to better understand change and uncertainty in this world in flux. This whole tension and the difference between approaching any given change and even someone asking you to help them, that's a
mm,
change.
yeah.
Some piece of what you thought you were going to have to do, you're now responding to a different a query, but it's a kind of change. And the difference that we find, that we see, that we can affect when we're showing up from a place of hope or fear, there's no one thing that matters more as far as I can tell. And it's a very subtle shift. And what I love is that no matter what else happens, no matter what changes, no matter what blindsides you, no matter what surprises you, whoever you are anywhere on the planet, and I hate to use the analogy, but I will even say, like, even if you're in solitary confinement in prison, you still have the ability and the choice to see a given change
Mm,
from hope or fear. And it's lovely. It's a very subtle shift. And not to say that it's easy, but just keeping that in the back of our mind changes so much. And I've been really surprised by how many people have shown me the different ways that can manifest,
mm,
both expected and unexpected. Anyway, it's a slight side
yeah.
note, but I think it may relate to some of what we'll talk about today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and to that, that's interesting. And what's one of the more surprising ways that someone has shown you that take place?
Well, it's the the way it's funny. It's not the it's a scenario that comes up often, but in many different ways. And so it never fails to surprise me, even though, it didn't just happen once.
Yeah.
There is this dynamic of when change, and when I speak about change in this context, I'm typically talking about the kinds of changes that we didn't want to have happen,
Mm,
the things that surprise us or blindside us. I always joke, like, the change we want to have happen, that's upside. That's easy. I don't think we
mm,
really need to talk about that so much. Like, that's the fun stuff. But, change we opt into, that's easy. Of
yeah.
course, humans love that kind of change. That's growth and evolution. I'm talking about the kind of change where you're like, oh man, that just blew up my plan.
Mm,
Oh man, like that's unfair. And you've got anger or resentment or anxiety or fear, any one of a range of negative or challenging emotions attached to it. But one of the most helpful, and again, it's always surprising, but there is this idea of when change like that happens, typically our brains default into we feel fear and anxiety because we default into what's the worst that could possibly happen.
mm,
Oh no, like this change happened, it's doomsday. Oh no, everything's gone to pot. Oh no, right? I mean, we go into this negative spiral of all the bad things could happen because of this one
mm,
change. And if you can actually catch yourself in that moment and pause and say, hold on, given that I have no idea how this is actually going to go, why don't I take a nanosecond and entertain what is the best thing that could possibly happen from this change? And that never ceases to surprise me or others, what I find. And where I get a surprise is when people come back to me with like, guess what I came up with for the best possible thing that could happen? And it was funny because it was even things, it'll show up often where like parents, something frustrating or challenging will happen to one of their kids. And, oh, it didn't work out that way. And by the end of this exercise, they've like mapped out this whole new destiny for their kid that's like amazing and beyond their wildest dreams, and their kids get excited. And no one knows if that's actually going to come to pass.
Mhm,
But it's this moment of surprise that can also turn into delight and joy and, not surprisingly, hope.
mhm. Yeah, that's fascinating and such a good way to frame it. And I think so many people, when something bad happens, that's the 2 a.m. When I think of the 2 a.m. Uh, thought process, because that's when it usually hits me, and I get up at 3:30. So if I wake up at 2, pretty much up. So it frustrates me when that happens.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's such an interesting lens to view it through, and it reminded me of something I was going to mention during this call anyway. But you reminded me of an aspect of it that I had forgotten about. And so when I first started reading your book about a month ago, um, I got hit with something that I was not expecting at all. So your book has come at a great time in my life. And so I'm a huge sports fan, as you can see behind me. Um, Big Cincinnati Bengals fan. I grew up in Indiana. I'm a lifelong fan, been through 30 years of pain to finally experience some
Wow.
joy. And so this year, in January, I went back home to Indiana, and I went to the first playoff game of the year against the Baltimore Ravens. And I was super excited. I'd never been to a Bengals playoff game before, because when I lived there, they didn't go to the playoffs, so it wasn't even possible. And I've never been able to make it back for one since. So I was very excited to go back. I was talking with my cousin, and she was helping to plan everything. Like, hey, when you get here, go here, do this. So she said, when you land, go to our Aunt Deb's house, and then we'll go from there. And so I did. Listening to music, excited, ready to kick off the weekend. The game was the next day. Ready to see family I hadn't seen in a long time. And I get to my Aunt Deb's house, and I walk in. It's just my mom. I'm like, "Where is everybody? Where's the party?" And she said, "Well, I need to tell you something. Your dad and I are getting a divorce." And I was just floored, because not in a million years did I see that coming. Yeah, I knew my dad wasn't happy. I saw that for 40 years. But never thought in a million years it would end like that, right? And so I was stunned, and in shock, and it was just the situation of it all, going from this excitement to this low, um, was crazy. And there's one thing I want to ask you about related to that in my reaction to it. But to kind of follow up on what you said about looking at it through a different lens, it reminded me that my wife, and actually a couple of people, said to me that weekend, well, if anything, maybe you and your brother can become closer as a result of this. Um, and so, when you said that, looking through a different, what's the best that can happen? Well, that's probably one of the best things that could happen from this is my brother and I become closer than what we've been recently. So it made me think of that. But one of the things I'm curious to get your take on is that when I got the news, normally I probably would have been mad for a lot of reasons. Mad that it blew up my weekend. Mad because it was happening. Mad at my dad for what had happened to lead to this. But I wasn't. I was later. But in that moment, I was just kind of numb, and almost like it wasn't surprising, but it was. Um, it was for that moment. And I've been thinking about why, because it was an uncharacteristic reaction for me. And my mom was surprised. She's like, "I didn't expect you to react so calmly." Um, and I was thinking afterwards, like, why did I react that way? And I'm wondering if, like, do you think with everything that's happened in the world recently, that COVID felt like a bad dream. It's like, when are we gonna wake up and realize this was just a bad dream? And it seemed like one thing after another for the last couple of years has kind of felt like that. Like, is this really happening? Is this just a dream? Are we gonna wake up and go back to normal again? So I wonder if I was just numb because now it's not surprising that anything would happen like that. So what do you think based on your experience, this topic?
Well, first, wow, there's a lot to unpack there, and this is really beautiful and wonderful. And I want to start by just acknowledging that I'm sorry that I'm sorry that your parents have had difficulties. I'm sorry that this is very disruptive to the family, and at the same time, um, I happen to be also in the camp of I'm really glad for all of you long term that they're actually going to get to lead into lives that they're more excited to live,
Mhm,
and that you as family will learn to adjust. And it doesn't mean that, it's the classic case of um you can't change other people. You can spend the rest of your life trying, but what they're doing is acknowledging that they can do better and that
mhm,
they can be better. And it may look like a different relationship structure, but that over time it actually might be a great thing for the whole family. Might
mm.
not feel that way right now, but
Exactly.
it can become that. And as you know, I mean, I have my own set of experiences around that, including what does it mean? You and your sibling, your relationship has now changed with it opens a window of opportunity
Yeah,
to do it
absolutely.
differently, to do it. And I hesitate about the word better because I think that we always do the best we can in that moment in time. The challenge is times change. And so what's best for a given moment in time may not be best for the following year, 10
Mm,
years from now or whatever, but that you and your brother and you and your parents, you have an opportunity, a window of opportunity to redefine things in a way that's better for all of you.
mhm,
Now, back to your question though, this is an interesting one. So I'm not going to say it's any one thing. I mean, you know me and my style. It's more like look at the menu of options that it could be and pick the one that suits you best, kind of like picking the clothing that fits you best, right?
mhm,
Not everyone's going to pick the same style or pick the same color or the same size, but there's something in there that will work for you. So on the one hand, it is very clear today that there is a process, a phenomenon that the best that I've seen it called is change fatigue. There is change fatigue happening everywhere. People are tired. There has been, I talk a lot about the difference between more and enough. There has been way too much change. Now, the challenge is that's not something you get to pick. You don't get to pick how much change there is in the world. And, I'm the first to say there is more change ahead. We can talk about that. That's not a bad thing. That can be a great thing, but there is more change ahead. So, this idea, though, it is very hard to respond to change for any system or organism to respond to ongoing change in a place of fatigue. So, I don't want to discount that your body may well have been continue to be in some kind of fatigue. It's just, the the tank is empty, the battery is drained. You don't have your full energy to give it. That is one scenario. I do want to challenge or question you though. When you think about the people, and I don't want to speak for you, but
mm,
I will simply say when one thinks about the people they admire the most and how they deal with bad news, trauma, difficulty, emergency, whatever, one of the words that many people often use is calm.
mhm,
We aspire to be calm when this sort of thing happens. So I want to give you some credit. You may have been tired. You may also actually have grown and be in a place where you can look at this and say, yeah, this is bad, but you know what? I'm going to accept it can't do much else. I mean, I can try to resist it, but that's just going to create more problem for you and everyone else. I'm going to accept it. I'm not going to say I'm happy about it. And also really important, as you noticed, I'm not going to say that like these are all the feelings I'm ever going to have about it. This is a process. But in that moment, to actually be able to be calm and present and just, even if you feel numb, to just be in it.
Mm.
You didn't try to run away. You didn't shout and scream or do things that some people might be embarrassed about afterwards, right? There was none of that. That's something to be really proud of. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know you well enough when I wasn't in your skin that day, but I reckon that part of how you showed up that way, we've all grown, I think, as part of the last 3 years. I think also in the process of life. And you do wonder, I do think I see this quite often where, and you know a little bit about my history and where many years ago, I lost both of my parents in a car crash. And I bring this up because that to me was my baptism into Flux. That was like ground zero. From there, it was, wow, change and uncertainty. How do we all learn to deal with it better? Which ultimately led to Flux and a lot of other things. But if I pull on that thread hard, that's where it all began for me. And I never thought I'd write a book about it and all that. But
Yeah.
like life changes and you move on. But this idea, I do remember being like, okay, I didn't want this to happen. I was struggling. I was angry. I was scared. I was all these different emotions. I do remember thinking, though, if I can get through this, there's very little in my life that I think could be harder. Now, I will be the first to say there's going to be more difficulty, more sadness, more loss. Like that's going to come. But if I can get through this, everything else is going to feel joyful in comparison. Everything else is going to feel easier in comparison. And you fast forward to today, and I do think a lot of people have had a really hard time. They've gone to depths that they're not used to going to. And all of a sudden, everything else has a kind of relative comparison to that. And so learning about your parents' divorce, really, really hard. But your baseline has changed because of the last few years. Your baseline has changed because of you're older. Your baseline has changed. And so you look at things now, and when we say in the grand scheme of things, right? In the grand scheme of things, said pre-pandemic, looks a little bit different than in the grand scheme of things when said today. So my hunch is that there may be a little bit of all of that in play, but I'll leave
Yeah.
it there.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And maybe the fact that I have kids now that might have influenced it a little bit. You know, I have to be different in front of them as their model, what they're looking up to, and the things I've learned in the past of how not to act in situations. I'm trying to
Yeah.
ensure that they don't do the same. Right.
Bingo. Well, and I was going to say, it's not that you need to be different around them. I would hope, like, you're always going to be fully you,
Mm.
hopefully, but that sense of what are the patterns and what are the principles and what are the values that you want your kids to remember,
Mm.
that you can actually experience something difficult and still get through it and approach it with loving kindness and still approach it with presence. And that doesn't mean that you can't be angry about things. It means that different emotions have their different times and manners of expression. But especially given that this is difficult for you, but this is really about your mom and your dad.
Mm.
This is really like, you want to talk about difficult and the difficulty that they must have taken to get to that point. And so the ability to just bear witness to that journey and bear witness to what comes next. And you imagine too, your kids growing up and having the memory of seeing that
Mm.
versus seeing, you know, a big family blow up. That will kids are kids are paying attention to everything. You know
Oh,
this
yeah.
better than anyone. Like they're paying attention and they're so smart.
Yeah.
And things like this will go a very long way. Also, more broadly, I would hope, you know, we're talking about this in the context of a family divorce, but I'm seeing everything through the lens of broader change and uncertainty. This isn't just about the divorce. This becomes imprinted for them on how people beyond family could deal with a whole range of change and uncertainty. It's exciting for me. I mean, it's bittersweet, right? It's very bittersweet. I don't want to deny that. But there is um, this opportunity for real growth, real hope, and a real foundation for your kids being built, which is very,
Mm,
very healthy, I think.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's already leading like to some change that's good and something that wouldn't have happened before. My mom's actually flying out. I'm in Spokane now, and she's flying out tomorrow. And she and I are going to take my 4-year-old and 2-year-old to San Diego to do pretty much a kid's vacation, the zoo and things like that. Which we had this planned prior to me finding that out. And it was just going to be me and my 2-year-old, just he and I to go and have some fun. And now she can travel more. And so I said, why don't you come out and get away from it all and take a break and join us in San Diego, see the kids. And so now she's coming, and now my 4-year-old was going to come too. So that would not have happened as a
See?
result,
There you
right?
go.
So already
Yeah.
moving towards some positive things. So,
Awesome.
so yeah,
Awesome. Yeah.
and and um, and so you said you never thought you'd write a book, and in the book you mentioned that the book was uh, many years in the making. What was the catalyst that happened that made you decide, okay, I should write a book about this?
Great question. I would say that so yes, for more than 20 years, for many years I had people saying, "You should write a book." I'm not exactly sure why, but for a long time, many people wanted me to write a travel book because um, I had spent many years without a permanent address. I had had a backpack, doing the sort of nomad thing before nomading was a thing, and before there were mobile phones, and before there was Airbnb. Like really flinging myself quite far. And they were like, "April's adventures, that would be so fun." And I was always like, no. I mean, I was too interested in doing the actual travels or whatever than just writing them up. But I think more importantly, I mention in the book, and it is one of those things that I figured would come up in some way, shape, or form in this conversation, that I did go through the experience of losing both of my parents when I was 20. It was profound. It was hard. It's not the thing that defines my life, but it's hard for me to talk about change and uncertainty without saying like
Mm,
that's where I got my original like seeds of wisdom and also seeds of like trial by fire. And ever since losing them, and part of this relates to how I was raised and values and things like that. The question that I always tried to ask myself, and I started at age 20, and I realized at that time not many 20-year-olds were asking this kind of question. But I was because of what I had been through. The question was always, if I were to die tomorrow, I don't want to, I don't intend to, but my goodness, it could happen to any of us.
mm,
Healthy, young, like we just don't know. If I were to die tomorrow, what would the world, and very clearly the world, not my ego, not social media, not a boss, what would the world need me to do today if I knew I were going to die tomorrow? And basically, for 20 plus years, I could not answer that question that the world would need me to write a book. It was always like, no, the world needs help. The world needs for me to be connecting dots and building bridges and doing things. It was never the world needs you to write a book. But in the process of those 20-ish years in which I was doing other things and I was working in global development and I was getting my graduate degrees and I was traveling and I was researching and I was advising and I was connecting all of these different dots, I was also starting to see a lot of patterns. And when I say patterns, patterns around how different people will navigate different kinds of change. Patterns in terms of how people and cultures around the world are trying to answer these things like how do we control what we can't control? How do we make sense of what we can't see? These things that were related to change and uncertainty. And I was starting to see these patterns and I was taking good notes the whole time. And basically, Travis, what happened, and I remember the exact day. I remember where I was. I remember everything about that moment, but it wasn't as though one thing happened. It was a waking up one morning, and I'll never forget it. I woke up and I was like, oh my goodness. After 20 plus years of people telling me, April, you should write a book, and actively resisting and refusing it, I woke up and I was like, I have a book coming out of me. And there is no way I can't not write this book. So I was like, oh. And what was interesting was that this wasn't about a book that I was going to write for other people so that I could tick that box and put it on my resume and move on. This was something much more personal and profound. It was the if I were to die tomorrow, I want to make sure that I can get these ideas out. If this is what I were to leave behind, it is time to get this out and leave this behind. I still hope I don't die, but like
Mm,
it is time.
mm,
And so I bring that up because there was definitely a kind of existential, like, now's the time. But also, it was when I realized that I wanted to do this and pour my heart and soul into this book and this project, not to make other people happy as much as I want to please people and do a good job and,
mm,
be a good citizen in the world. It was something that was much more, I'm going to do this because I believe it matters, and I'm gonna let go of the rest, if that makes sense. Like, let go in terms of, like, and this plays out so much in the world of book publishing. Of course, I want the book to do well, but I'm not defining myself by whether or not it makes a bestseller list.
mm,
I want it to help others, but I'm gonna just write it in a way that hopefully it's just accessible to people, that they can make it their own,
mm,
that sort of thing. But that happened, it was in 2014 when that happened, so almost like 20 years
wow,
later, and it was like this new chapter. Now, of course, I could tell this book was gonna happen. There was no way it was not gonna get written, and that was fascinating, though, because you really were like, "Oh my gosh, even if I tried to resist this change within me, I forget it. I gotta
yeah,
go with this because it is happening." But then even at that point, had I figured out the structure? Had I figured out the title? No. All
mm,
of that took, again, more years, more time. But that was the moment that I knew, and I think more broadly, the message that I like to tease out here, which isn't about me, it's about each and every one of us, is that on the whole, I find in conversations I have with others, human intuition, human wisdom, that human sixth sense
mm,
is really, really good. It's really strong. And for many people, it's buried. For many people, it's been kind of forgotten, but it's never been long. And I hope more and more that humans can learn to trust that intuition and trust, get to
mm,
know if it's been buried, get in touch with it, uncover it, excavate it. And once you have, to get to know it and to trust it and to use it, because I think it's one of the most powerful tools we have. And it's interesting because we talk a lot about the power of technology, and we think about technology as being modern day technologies and devices and electronics and all that. I think one of the most powerful technologies we ever have and ever will have is the technology of human consciousness.
mhm.
And that's where a lot of that intuition and wisdom resides.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I agree. There's been times in my life where I've just had a gut feeling and I'm like, where is this coming from? I don't know why I'm feeling this, yeah, and it was right, so yeah. I mean, I think that's where everybody wants to talk about AI and everything, but AI doesn't have a conscious, right? So I think that's where people are still going to have the edge over AI.
It is interesting. You bring up a really interesting point, though. Like, what is the role of intuition? Because, I mean, what's interesting is when you can go through that much data very quickly, it's not intuition that evolves, though. It's
Right.
just like generalization. But, like, what is the role? There is no sixth sense. And to your point,
Mm,
I hope that never, I cannot envision a future in which some kind of sixth sense can evolve from a non-sentient being. And I think
yeah.
that's the sense making. The ability to make sense requires being sentient.
Mm,
So
yeah.
anyway, we will see. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's that culmination of experiences and an ability to connect the dots, right? Which maybe AI can connect the dots, but the personal human experience is missing
Yeah.
in the intuition
Yeah.
piece formula, right?
Yeah, you're right. And what's interesting also, I'm just remembering back to something you talked about earlier, this fear and this hope versus fear, and this
Mm,
moment in which I was like, oh my goodness, there is a book coming out of me. And what was fascinating is that I could have spent 10 years prior feeling that way, but being racked by fear,
mm,
fear of failure, fear of I didn't know where to go, fear of like, what will people think of me? And it was fascinating because in that moment where I was like, "Whoop, this is happening," there was no space. There was no space for fear. And I've never actually shared this with any. I'm thinking about this now. There was no space for fear. Now, it wasn't that I was wildly optimistic and like, off we go, like it was just this moment of of intuition and of placing fear aside, saying, yep, I know what that is. I know what fear is. I'm going to sort of put it in my pocket. I know it's there. I can pull it out if I need to, but otherwise, it's not going to help.
mm.
And that's the piece, that's when you can put that kind of fear aside that allows you to move through the difficult stuff and the scary stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that's the important thing is giving it a place to go, right? I think that's what a lot of people miss. And I remember Seth Godin mentioning one time, where do you put the tired? And he talked about marathon runners
Mm.
and people doing things that exert a lot of energy, and you figure out, and I saw that you're a half marathon runner, very impressive time. And I used to run marathons, haven't for a long time, but you find a place to put that tire, right? I think you have to do the same thing with fear as well.
1,000%. And I will actually tell you, I do believe I ran my last marathon last year. And this is a total aside, Travis, but what's fascinating, and I love to run. I found the 5K, 10K, half marathon, like those are happy
Mm,
distances for me. But there was a difference because I was running this marathon. And when you get to the point, and I love running as much as I ever have, but I
mm,
had this moment of like, I'm just done. I don't need to do this. I don't need, and this joyful, I was always like, oh, if I run my last marathon, that means I'm getting old and I can't do things I used to do before. And I was like, no, actually, I think that if I don't run marathons, I could do better at the halves. I could do
mm,
better at the 10Ks. This no longer does it for me.
mm.
And also I can run marathons up in the hills on trail runs, but I'm not running it for like speed or on a course. And, I'm going to get swept off the course if I don't go fast enough. But it was funny. I bring this up. I never imagined that my last marathon that I would feel joy. And yet I was like, in that moment, I was like, I've always wondered when my last marathon will be. And I was like, I know when it is. It's right now. And I feel great. And I'm going to finish this. I'm going to finish this one. And then I'm done. And
That's
it's
awesome.
funny, ever since then, I've never looked back. Anyway,
Nice.
I digress. Wait, what was the question? Sorry, I should
No,
remember.
no, you answered it. You answered it.
Oh,
It
but I also, real quick, it's where does the tired go? I did want to put a
yeah.
PS on this though. Um, I do think it's the idea of where does the fear go? That oftentimes many people, myself included, for many, many years, I beat myself up
Mm,
around fear. You should be stronger than that. You should know better. You know better than that. You're better than that. You can put fear in its place. And I was hypercritical about my own fear, which ironically just fed the fear and the worry and the anxiety. But I realize there's a difference when you tell fear, don't be silly, you have no place here, be an adult, whatever. That also diminishes the identity of fear. It makes it seem almost like it doesn't matter and it has no place and it has no value. And I'm always cautious and keenly aware that a little bit of a lot of things can be good for us. For example, a little bit of anxiety is a tremendous motivator. A little bit of fear keeps you from jumping off cliffs when you shouldn't. It's like the difference
Yeah.
between don't do something that's foolish or rash. A little bit of sadness helps you feel greater joy. Like a little bit of these things can be helpful, but very quickly we can get into the toxic territory. And so knowing where your limit is and that the threshold is much lower than I think many people believe. But what I found is that when I actually could make friends with the fear and at least see it and acknowledge it and say, I realize you're here because you care about me. I realize you're here because you want to protect me. I also realize that you have crossed the line between healthy and toxic.
Mm.
And so, thank you very much. We're going to put this aside. It's a very subtle but different dynamic around how we see that fear. And then being able to, it's almost like you're putting it aside, but you're doing so with dignity and respect as opposed to putting it aside out of shame or putting it aside out of guilt. And that's a piece that, like Seth said, where do you put it? That you actually create a nice, comfortable home for it so that it doesn't come back and keep knocking on your door.
Mm.
It actually goes to that chair in the corner and stays there. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
But I think that's a helpful analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And always acknowledging that it's there, right? And knowing, hey, it's there.
Yes.
It's not going anywhere. But I'm in control of kind of what
Yeah.
the
And
decisions I make, right?
acknowledging that it actually, at its core, it wants to help you. At its core, it wants to protect you. It wants to make sure that you survive. But acknowledging that it's crossed the line between healthy and harmful, it's crossed the line between beneficial and toxic, and that, enough's enough. It's kind of like when you give a kid a timeout. You're not saying you don't love them. You're not saying that you don't need to develop your personality and character. You're saying you've crossed the line into, expressing your personality is one thing. What you just did is something else entirely. So,
Yeah.
time out and learn a lesson. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you were talking about that, it actually just made me kind of think of it in a different way. Yeah, it ties into one of your chapters about kind of looking staying too focused on the future, and I think that fear it is a protection mechanism for the moment. It's really bad at seeing the future, right? And that's where we come in and we put it in its place because we're not living in the future, but we have enough of the sixth sense to know what the possibility is, right? And possibility is something that fear, I don't think, really can understand too well.
Fear shuts down possibility faster than pretty much any other force. Yep. And you're talking about the final chapter of the book, the last superpower, not final chapter, but the last superpower of the eight, which is what I call letting go of the future. And it's fascinating because, especially people who know me as a futurist, they're like, wait a minute, how can you say that as a futurist? Like, that's not allowed, right? And I always like to joke, like, when I say let go of the future, it's not necessarily what you may think. First of all, when I say let go, I do not mean give up. I do not mean failure. I do not mean shirking your responsibilities or like let go, like, oh, so much for that. None of that. What I'm talking about is our relationship to control and how obsessed we have become, I think, individually and collectively, with wanting to predict and control the future as if there is like one future. And I always like to remind people there is no one future. There are many different possible futures that we are all bringing into being every single day, whether we realize it or not. And so let go of this need to say the future has to be this way. And if it's not this way, if it doesn't go my way, everything's, gone to pot. That's not it at all. Get ready for a future in which there is so much uncertainty and change and unknowables that What we're trying to do is map out what are the possible futures that could play out. And could you find a place for yourself and a way through and an ability to contribute in each and every one of them? And when you can do that, letting go is actually counterintuitively, but very profoundly, letting go is actually empowering. Letting go gives you the kind of power that really matters, which is the power to be okay no matter what happens. Letting go also, I think of it as when when we're trying to control, we tend to we grasp onto things. We just want them to work this way and we push really hard. And that sucks out a lot of air and oxygen and energy from other things that could be brought to life, right? And think about how much when you obsess about a particular outcome,
Mm.
you invest all your time and energy. Like there's no space in your head
Right.
for anything else when you're obsessing about something, right? When you let go of that, all of a sudden you realize I have space and again, oxygen and energy to create for new ideas, for new possibilities, for new outcomes. And it's exactly what you're talking about. Fear stamps out possibility, letting go opens it up.
Mm.
And yet, people have, on the whole, people have a really complicated relationship with control and they do not want to let go. And often you'll appreciate that, like, intellectually, I think a lot of people realize we need to let go. Particularly, we need to let go of things that aren't working anymore. We
Mm.
need to let go of bad habits. We need to let go of poorly designed models. We need to let go of a lot of things in the world today. But then the actual doing of that is incredibly hard. It is incredibly hard, even if you know the system is broken, to lean into something where the system isn't already in place. It's very hard to think about we're going to build something new that's going to be better, but we may not see it on day one. There's going to be that limbo, that transition. And that's what unravels a lot of people. And yet, that is what leads to the best possible outcomes when you look historically, when you look time and time and time again.
Mm.
So I see it as a huge opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in my podcast is, it's focused on careers. And I think
Mhm.
in the change that happens with careers and about making pivots and moving into something different, and then how to manage that. Because once you make that
Mhm.
pivot, talk a lot about portfolio careers, and I'm a big fan of that concept. I had David Nabinski on my show, and he has a whole podcast about portfolio careers, and I'm a huge fan of that. But when you go down that road as a former recruiter, I also know how companies think when it comes to hiring, and your resume becomes, it might as well be in a foreign language at that point, right? Because it doesn't follow the career path that everyone is expecting to see on your resume. Um, and so, a- a- and and yeah, I don't know where I was going with this, but
Well,
I
here,
just had like a
let me
little
pick this
brain
up.
freeze. But
Let me Don't worry, let me pick this up because I figured, winding careers that we would talk at some point about
mm,
career portfolios, but also want to add a little color and context to what you just shared, and maybe we discuss, debate, whatnot. So, as a segue, so we've got letting go of outdated models that
mm,
no longer fit. I would argue that for the last 2 centuries, the career shape, the career model that we looked at was a ladder to climb up or a path to pursue to ever higher plateaus. But these career shapes were linear, one directional, one choice up, right?
mm,
Forward. Career ladders were, are an artifact, a product of the first industrial revolution. They came about at the same time that factories and steam engines came about. Today, we're in the fourth industrial revolution. I would argue a lot has changed in 250 years,
mm,
yet we're still stuck in this traditional model. It is a wonderful example of something we need to let go of. However, people are like, yes, and I think you would probably agree, talent, HR leaders, CEOs, everyone acknowledges we need something new,
mm,
but they're afraid of letting go because they don't know what comes next.
right.
I offer that this career portfolio and the shape of one's career, seeing one's career not as a path to pursue forward, or a ladder in particular, a ladder that someone else built that they want you to climb it.
Mm.
And you sort of like, okay, I'll climb it. Like if you have one life to live, make sure you're on the right ladder. And ideally it's
Yeah.
a ladder you built that not someone else built for you. So all these reasons, like people are saying we need a change. That the portfolio is a much more holistic way of looking at who you are, what you can do, and rather than this ladder to climb, another analogy, which I know you're familiar with, is this idea of a jungle gym. You're going to climb up and around and underneath, and like it's not one directional. It is a jungle gym. It is a lattice where you can climb again up over diagonal, and it acknowledges that you are so much more than your resume. And I think that's the real crux here. When I think about what's on the typical resume, and then when I think about great humans, great leaders, great individuals, their resumes, like, yeah, it's a part of them, but it's only a tiny part of who they are and what they can
Mhm.
do. And as far as I can tell, it's often not even the most interesting parts
Yeah.
in terms of what they need to succeed in the workplace. And so back to HR though, and this is where I would love, so I do a lot of work with individuals and with organizations. In my experience, two things I want to bring out. One, HR loves the concept. They do want to hire talent. They realize that talent, the best talent isn't goes beyond their resumes. They are largely stuck in an organizational design structure that's like, great, we can solicit all these different applications, but at the end of the day, we're still going to find ourselves stuck in having to select the person with 20 years in the same vertical, working their way up because our system doesn't know any different. So that's a big problem, but it's solvable because it's organizational design.
Mhm.
So that's one piece that I would love to like, do you agree with that? Do you think actually, let me ask you, like they are they are coming along in that regard. Well, and actually let me just mention the other piece because it's related. The other piece is that when hiring the key connector here is what I call a portfolio narrative. It is the story behind why did you develop a narrative? And what happens is you can have imagine a candidate that has done 10 different things in their life, and each of those things has taught them something different, and they've been expected and unexpected. And, let's say that they even had to take time out because a family member was ill. And let's say that they spent a couple of years volunteering. And let's say that they were in a job that they turned out they hated it. So they left, but they took those skills and applied them in this different sector, right? Lots of different things. That same candidate can either look totally scattered, totally unfocused, like who did this, right?
Mm.
Or that candidate can look like, oh my goodness, this person has 10x the skill of any other candidate. We have to hire them first. This is like this person is beyond what we thought was possible. The difference between those two candidates is whether they can tell that story,
Mm.
whether they can connect those dots for recruiters. And so that's what I call the portfolio narrative. And that's this missing link that a portfolio in a vacuum could easily look scattered. A portfolio that has been curated and has a narrative behind it can look more compelling than any traditional candidate who's climbed a ladder. So what do you think about that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. I mean, I think the biggest challenge is it comes down to risk, and that is where companies fail to move beyond this whole resume thing, right? Is because the hiring manager can't make a bad hire. The recruiter can't send somebody that turns out to be a bad hire, and um, but I absolutely agree on the narrative, um, and I think that's kind of where I was going as well. Is we're in this flux right now with people being laid off, and
Mhm.
they probably have this idea of the future and this outcome, and I think they should let go of that. And kind of like you mentioned with the jungle gym, like what if they did get off that ladder? What if they did move adjacent to what they're doing? What exists? What could be interesting and fun? And how can they get that experience and do that thing now? Well, they can't. Like they're at a
Yeah.
forcing function.
Well, it's fascinating too, because when you're laid off, you're kind of thrown off the ladder.
Mhm.
or at least temporarily, right? What I find fascinating is that there are so many people, once you're off the ladder, so many people who you realize they never wanted to get on the ladder. They never got on it. They're doing things, they're designing all kinds of things in different ways. And it makes you question, why have I been on this ladder? Who put me
Yeah.
here? Did I really want this? You know? And
Yeah.
so, but this portfolio approach, this portfolio model is more holistic from that perspective. And I want to be really clear. I am not saying that ladders are somehow inherently bad or no, you know what they are? They're one model. They're
Mm.
one model that for many years we had one choice. We didn't really have a choice. It was like ladder or what?
Yeah.
The fact is today we have a lot more choice to design and work and earn income and contribute to society and build business and have impact and all the rest in many different ways. So again, kind of what I was saying earlier, like what kind of clothing fits you best?
Mm.
There will still be some people who try to get on the ladder. There will some people that make their way up the ladder, but more and more you have people going like, I don't even want to be on that ladder.
Right.
If they're on it, they can often feel stuck. But the challenge when you're laid off, going back, kind of coming full circle, when you're laid off, that is the kind of change you did not control. There's a very different feeling that comes from you're on the ladder, you realized, I don't really want to be here, and you take yourself off of it,
Mm.
versus you might have been on the ladder. You may or may not have wanted to be on the ladder, but someone else is like, you're off the ladder now. But the
Mm.
fact is, the result is the same. So back to this mindset shift of where you're like, how do I look at this as like the best thing that could have possibly happened to me? Because it's actually going to nudge me towards the thing I was meant to be doing. It's actually going to nudge me to build my self awareness, to get clear on what really does matter to me, and to recognize that, in fact, whatever ladder, if I'm going to be on a ladder, it should be on a ladder that I had some agency over in terms of bringing my best self to it. So I look at layoffs. Layoffs are hard. Layoffs, I'm not gonna sugarcoat them for a minute, but I am going to say they are full of opportunity, full of the ability for people to get closer to what they were really meant to do. And if someone says my mission in life was to be on this ladder, then that's going to be especially hard. But that's when we start to get into the territory of how much of our personal identity have we invested in our professional identity, and how important it is to recognize, as you know, a different Flux superpower, that regardless of anything else, your value, your worth to society, and your ability to matter on this earth has never hinged on a job. You have always been enough, and no single job, no single title is ever going to change that. You were always enough when the moment you were born, and you always will be, regardless of what you do or don't do. That's a helpful reminder that I think a lot of people haven't heard often enough these
Mm.
days. And so that's what gets you into this kind of crisis mindset of like, well, now what? Now what next? Whereas in fact, it's just there's opportunity all around you.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I would say the two times that I've been let go, laid off, whatever, fired, whatever you want to call it,
Hmm.
were the two best things that have ever happened to me in my career's trajectory, because it changed that trajectory in a
Yeah.
more positive direction, into a direction that I may not have done if I wouldn't have been forced to actually do it and have that the agency to make that change happen. Right. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I want to be respectful of your time. I have one quick thing. Do you have a minute?
Yeah. Sure. Sure. Yeah.
So the one thing that really resonated with me about the portfolio careers chapter
Mhm.
was, and I'm a big fan of Cal Newport, and I love his book, So Good They Can't Ignore You. And in the concept of career capital, that what you've done isn't a sunk
Mhm.
cost, even if you make a completely different pivot. When you mentioned being the only one, how a portfolio career and how different experience can actually create you as being the only one. When I reflected on that, it kind of has changed the way I'm positioning my business now, my consulting business. And now,
Mhm.
thanks for causing a lot of work. And I have to go redo my website
Yeah.
because now I
My
have to
pleasure.
change it
My
because
pleasure.
And it's the kind of change that I'm happy to make and the work I'm happy to put in because now I am gonna be able to tell that narrative. Here's how my experience comes together to make me uniquely suited to solve this problem for this certain market. And so that was kind of a light bulb moment for me when I read that.
Awesome.
So just wanted to share that
Awesome.
because it was a
Sorry.
big part of that book.
That love that. Well, and that's fabulous. And I'm sorry it's a little extra work now, but it's gonna, I think, pay dividends for the rest of your life. And I do
Absolutely.
always like to remind people this might be a nice way to kind of come full circle as well. That so much when we, particularly, if you're fired, you're forced to reconcile this as well. This idea of um, who do other people want us to be versus who do we want to be, and how do they see our gifts versus how do we see our gifts and what we want to grow into and so forth. And this reminder of you will never, ever succeed at trying to be someone else. There will
Yes.
always be someone who is better at that someone else. However, no one, no one will ever be a better you than you. So this whole notion of like, what is your niche? Like, no one, no one will eclipse you being you. So what is that unique combination? And once you realize this, and that's not something anyone can ever take it away from you. No one can ever fire you from that. Figure out what it is and, cultivate it for the rest of your life. So let me know when your website is updated. I look forward to seeing it. And
I will.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
my pleasure.